Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world. Now it's been said with the forthcoming release of Warhammer Old World there will only be two playable factions upon release, the Tomb Kings and the Bretonnians, these being the factions that have the full book support and, crucially, models available from Games Workshop. So, what if you're not a returning player with a stack of old models and want to play one of the other 7 factions that are going to form part of the game? Well, a discussion's broken out around various places that you can get models from, be it eBay, 3D printing, or alternative providers. And today I want to talk about one of those providers because I think their development is quite interesting, and that is Mantic Games. Now, before I go into that, yes, I know that there's an argument out there that if you want to play Warhammer, you should buy Games Workshop figures, and if you don't buy Games Workshop figures, that's what's going to kill the game, and it's all your fault. And on the flip side, you've got the people that, when asked the question, where do you get figures from, will answer 3D printer, go brrr. They're the two extremes, really. But if you want new figures and you don't want to scour eBay for a decent deal and want to look at someone else, there are a lot of companies out there producing fantasy figures in a way that simply didn't exist during the Warhammer Fantasy Battle days, even really for 8th edition, which is where Mantic comes onto the scene. So I said they're quite interesting, at least they are from my perspective. So I first became aware of Mantic Games during those days of 8th edition. I think they were quite a new company then. Kings of War had not long come out, though I didn't actually play that until after the whole End Times thing. But what it did seem that Mantic were doing were offering alternative figures for a lot of the Games Workshop stuff at a much more affordable price. Starting with, I think they had dwarves, orcs, and undead early on. Now, there was just one problem at the time, and that was the figures, in my opinion, were awful. The aesthetic was terrible, the detail wasn't great, they just looked, well, they were so far below the standard of Games Workshop, it wasn't even funny. Now, I hasten to add, this is very much a personal opinion. And I've seen that opinion online shared as well. But if you're someone that liked those aesthetics or felt buying Mantic models was the way that allowed you to afford to be able to play Warhammer and to enjoy your hobby, wargaming is a broad church. You do what you need to do to enjoy yourself. If you and your friends are having fun, doesn't matter. My opinion doesn't matter. No one else's opinion matters. If you're enjoying the hobby. And if everyone around you is enjoying the hobby, who cares? Anyway, that digression aside, back to the figures. Now, as I said, I always thought Mantic figures, they weren't particularly good. They had a couple that were alright. I think their zombie models were alright. I had some of those for a Vampire Count's army, which I was trying out. But the rest of the range, the skeletons and stuff, they really didn't do it for me. No, I did, as I say, play Kings of War 1st edition, had a couple of games of that, and I enjoyed the game, and I enjoyed the fact that even when you took a battering in your opponent's turn, you could still dish it back out. The game would swing one side to the other. It was interesting in a way that, for such a simple game, I didn't think would be possible. But I wasn't really part of a group that played Kings of War, so I kind of left the whole concept behind. Fast forward a few years, and Games Workshop, at the same time as Kings of War 3rd edition was announced Warhammer is returning, and we will be getting a game called Warhammer the Old World at some point in some years' time. And I started to take a little bit more of an interest in what was available in the market, what was going on. And my eyes turned once again to Mantic. It's a company I'd heard of. It's one that was, I believe, set up by, or at least certainly had a number of ex-GW staff floating around in it. So I took a bit more of an interest in their offering. I think I'd seen a couple of videos online of people painting their figures as well. And I'll have to admit, I was absolutely amazed by what I was seeing. Certainly, I think their Ratkin, I think they call them, and their Goblin ranges. The Goblin kit looks absolutely amazing. And if I was doing Orcs and Goblins, I would definitely be looking at their Goblin models. The Orcs, no, because they're these old, clunky original sculpts, and I don't like the Black Orc equivalent Orcs they've brought out since. But some of those new, say, the new ranges, the Goblins, etc., they look really nice. I mentioned in a recent video that my project for 2024 was going to be an Empire army. Again, it's one of these armies which aren't being supported directly by Games Workshop at the moment by miniature releases. That will come, I have no doubt, but they're not here yet. So I had to make a decision about what figures I wanted to get. And I decided I could tell an interesting story, I thought, with halflings. So I turned to Mantic and I bought their starter army box for the halflings. I thought the models looked all right in the pictures and they were a good price, so I'll give them a go. And I have to say, I've been really pleasantly surprised about what I've seen so far. So in the army box, you get 40 infantry, which can be equipped with partisans by the looks of them. So really a cross between a spear and a polearm. Well, a pole is a polearm, but you get my point. Or rifles. And 20 cavalry, which can have the same weapons. There's also, I think, hand weapon shield options as well in the box for them. There's also a character, a wizard riding a giant dog, along with a war machine type thing, which it looks a bit odd. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but that comes from not playing Kings of War. Now, the models themselves, they don't have egregious mold lines. Yes, they have them, but they're plastic figures. You've got to expect that. And they're kind of charming in their own sort of way. They don't have tons and tons of detail. They've got enough detail to be interesting, but not so much detail as they're going to be an absolute pain in the backside to paint. And I think this is something that Games Workshop have fallen into the trap of, certainly with their 40k figures recently, where as the technology's moved on and you've been able to get sharper models with more detail, they have really laid on the detail. And some of the figures they produce now, some of the Space Marines, for example, have so much detail, they take an absolute age to paint, and there's so much detail on it, you feel you've got to try and at least tackle most of it. And it's not particularly great, I think, for perhaps newer players. However, these are looking really straightforward to do, say, charming in their own sort of way, and I think I'll be able to bash through them at a reasonable rate, which is good because I want to get them onto the table. And it's this improvement over the last 8 years or so, which I think personally is quite interesting. They've gone from a company that sells stuff in an aesthetic where I have no real interest in them. The quality of the models and the casts are not great, whereas now the newer stuff, the things they're starting to produce more recently, is looking really, really good, and I think would fit in perfectly well with a fantasy army, be it the halflings I've just mentioned, the goblins that I've seen, and their version of the Skaven. So I think Mantic have become a really good example of how the market's changed since the days of 8th edition, what's available out there. When I was building my dwarf army, and there's a whole bunch of videos on that you can go and check out, I was mostly using the Oathmark range of models, which were made by North Star. And I really enjoyed painting those. Again, they had enough detail to be interesting, but not so much detail that they took ages to paint. So I think really my concluding thought on this is, if you're not wedded to the whole Games Workshop thing and you're not someone that has easy access to a 3D printer, or just don't like the idea of 3D printing or working with resin, there are actually a lot of companies out there producing some really good quality figures which can be used for most of the armies that you want to use. The choice is there as a customer, as a consumer, and I would certainly encourage people to think very much before they buy around what suits their need the best. So what do you think? Do you think that the Mantic models have improved? Have they always been good in your eyes, or have they always been terrible? Are there any other manufacturers out there you think are doing a particularly good job? Maybe Wargames Atlantic, for example. Maybe you like Warlord games. The Perrys, of course, the classic Perry twins that made so many of those classic Warhammer figures that now have their own company, producing a lot of medieval stuff, which would fit nicely with Bretonnia or Empire. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening. I am Return to the Old World. Have a great day.